Hi and welcome to my channel and welcome to this video. Today we are looking at the aorist tense in the middle and passive voice as we study New Testament Greek. As we go through these different aspects of verbs, you might want to take a look back at the grammar section and the structure of the language that I did at the start, just so you can get an idea as to what these different terms are, what the aorist is, what the middle voice is, what the passive voice is. I'll just do a little bit of a look back over those things and the important things to remember. Firstly, the aorist is a once-off past tense. So the action of the verb was once off. It's not ongoing or continuous like with imperfect or present tense. But very occasionally it's also used to mean a once-off action in the present tense, where it would be alongside something that puts it in the present tense, another verb. But normally we think of it as a past tense verb. The middle voice generally conveys some sort of movement. It could be movement in terms of space or time or thought or emotion or some sort of theoretical movement, but it's usually some sort of coming and going, coming into being, becoming, being born, something like that. And the passive voice is where the subject doing the verb actually benefits from the action they receive from it. It might be that they might receive something negative from it, like if somebody's afraid or has fear, you might describe that as a passive sense, passive voice verb, or they might actually benefit from it in some way. The person or thing benefiting will be changed by the action of the verb. Sometimes the middle voice is just sort of in between the active and the passive. In English, we don't really have the sense of a middle voice and passive voice in the same way. So sometimes these are a little bit harder to translate. But that's good for us looking at Greek, because it means that there are some extra things that we can learn, because Greek and ancient Greek, Koine Greek, has a much higher level of specificity. That means it's more specific about certain details. So we can find details in Koine Greek that are quite difficult to convey in English. In terms of the New Testament, the aorist tense is unique in that there's going to be a middle and a passive voice in all moods. So we will get indicative, subjunctive, imperative, infinitive verbs and participles that have aorist tense verbs in the active, middle and passive voice. The future tense does also have a distinctive passive, but it won't appear in these other moods. It's only in the indicative. Certainly in the New Testament. It does exist in these other moods, but not in the New Testament. Whilst the other verbs that appear in all of these forms, the present tense, for example, appears in all of these forms, doesn't have a distinctive middle and passive. It's the same endings for middle and passive. The aorist has separate endings for the middle and for the passive. I'm not going to go into great detail in this video. We'll come back to that at a later stage. For those of you who don't want to go on to study Greek at an academic level, if you're just looking to use apps, parsing software and stuff, this video is just going to give you a bit of an overview of the aorist middle and aorist passive without lots of academic detail, and you can come back to that or look around at other texts to find out more about it. But I'm going to give you some overview and some general rules and things to look out for. So an epsilon augment is going to be added like with the other past tense verbs. This is only in the indicative mood. And a sigma before the ending plus the thematic vowel, which is an alpha in the first aorist. Things are a little bit different with the second aorist. Rather than adding the alpha or the thematic vowel, it's going to be an epsilon or omicron. Now remember that the stem of the word in the second aorist can look completely different. We have to learn the stems for second aorist as well. But all the rest of the time, the stems stay pretty much the same. It's the second aorist verbs that are a bit complex. So you don't have to just learn the endings, you have to learn that the form can change. And if you're using parsing software or interlinear, you only just really need to be aware that this can happen. And when a dictionary or concordance or lectionary tells you that it has a second aorist, just be aware that it can change form completely. The middle voice has its own set of endings in the aorist. So the second aorist follows the imperfect middle. They have the same endings as the imperfect without the sigma augment. So it's only the stem change that shows you that it's aorist, not imperfect. It also doesn't have that alpha as a thematic vowel. Again, it'll be epsilon or omicron. Then with the passive voice, if you look at the fifth point here, the passive voice has its own set of distinctive endings in the second aorist, the first aorist as well, and the future tense. This is just indicative verbs we're talking about here. The first and second aorist passives have the same thematic vowel. You'll get an eta, and they have the same endings, but in the first aorist, the stem starts with the theta followed by an eta, and then the verb ending. The theta also follows the stem and precedes the endings in the future passive tense as well as the aorist. So we can spot the theta and see it as a sign that there's going to be a passive. Usually when it's got a theta towards the end, at the beginning of the ending and at the end of the stem, it's going to be a passive, unless that theta is already part of the original stem spelling. That's a good way to spot a passive tense, and it actually completely changes the sound of the sentences. I think it actually sounds softer. It sounds like it's passive. So I always encourage people to say these out loud as part of your learning. Firstly, it will help you to commit it to memory much easier, but also with stuff like this and so many other things, you'll find it really makes sense when you say it out loud. You can hear that things change as you go into the passive voice. And another big thing to remember in terms of translation is whether something is transitive or intransitive. You might have heard these terms from learning other languages, but basically transitive involves an object, so the action of the verb is being done by the subject to an object. Intransitive verbs are verbs where you don't need an object to make that sentence make sense. So an intransitive might be that lions hunt. Fine, on its own doesn't need an object for that hunting. But if it was transitive and you were going to have an object in there, you might say the lion hunted the gazelle. That would be transitive. Some verbs only make sense as transitive or intransitive. If I say I clapped my hands, that would be transitive because there's an object there. Even if I just said I clapped, the object is implied in that sentence because clapping intrinsically involves our hands, so it has to have an object in it, the verb to clap. Whereas you might say birds fly, or birds can fly. It doesn't have to have an object. They're not doing that verb to something else. They're just doing the doing verb. So it's intransitive. And this does make a difference when we look at Koine Greek and think about how to translate sentences. So let's have a little look at these endings in the middle and passive voice. Again, we're going to use the verb luo, meaning I loose or I set something free, and use that as an example. Now, luo doesn't actually appear in all these forms, but we use it as an example. When we look at the second aorist, we're going to have to use a different word because luo is a first aorist word. It doesn't have a second aorist. So I'll come back to that in a sec. But so we start with luo. In the middle voice, that would have come luomai. Check out the present middle video to find out more about that one. To put it into the future, we added the sigma. That becomes lusomai. In the imperfect, it would have been eluon for active and eluomain for middle. The imperfect and the present have no different passive voice. So when we see eluomain, we don't know whether it's middle or passive without looking at the context that it's in. Luamai in the same, in the present tense, we don't know. Usually the context will be quite clear. It's going to be middle if it's a sort of motioning verb, as I said, and it's passive if the subject of the verb is receiving in some way or benefiting in some way. In the aorist, it gained the epsilon augment and the sigma augment, so we had elusa. Now in the middle voice that becomes elusamein, and in the passive voice eluthane. So spot that theta followed by eta, and hear how it sounds. It sounds quite soft. You put that thane, so eluthane. You might notice I do a separate video on future passives, but you might notice also the future does have a passive voice in the indicative mood. Luthesomai. A tiny little word with just a 2-letter stem has become a much longer word with 9 letters in it there, and it can become longer still, by the way. Luthesomai for the future passive. Now let's look at another verb. Akuo is a good one to hear because we're going to actually see that in the middle and passive voice as well as the active, the verb to hear. So what would that mean? If you want to see the difference between active, middle and passive, perhaps you might say, and you actively listen. So I listen is how you might translate that as an active. If it was in the middle voice, you might be talking about something else that's going on and they are hearing it. If it was in the passive, they're receiving from it. You might say they heard in the aorist, and there might be some indication of a change. So there might be they heard something and changed their mind. But in Greek, we have an ability to give a bit more detail. In the English, it's a bit difficult to tell whether that was middle or passive. Hearing, it could be middle, it could be passive. In Greek, that's going to be clear. So let's have a little look. We have akuo becomes akuomai for the middle and passive. That's present tense. In the future, akuso would become akusomai, or in passive, akuthesomai. In the perfect, the alpha at the beginning gets lengthened by the epsilon augment to become akuon. And in its middle voice, akuomein, doesn't have a separate passive voice. That form caters for both middle and passive, and you'll have to work it out in the context as to which it is. And then the last row there, if we look at it in the aorist, firstly we have aku with sa, akusa, for aorist active becomes akusan. Then in the middle voice we have akusamein, and the passive akuthane. So you can sort of tell that there's a harder sort of sound to that ending, akusan rather than akuthane. It's a softer sound. Now, as I said, with luo, akuo doesn't have a second aorist form, certainly not in the Bible. Sometimes these words do in older documents, but we're just going to talk about what's actually in the Bible. So I've got some different words to show you an example. For example, lambano, the verb to receive, I receive, becomes elabon in the active. That's the one, that's the example we looked at before. But that doesn't have a middle voice. So I've used the most common middle voice verb to be an example in the next column. In the blue, the agenomein. The verb to become, that gen bit is like Genesis, to be born, to become, to come into existence, is agenomein in the middle. And we see that for sort of people becoming, often used in the middle voice, very common. And then in the bottom right hand corner box in the green, I've put agraphane. This is an aorist tense passive of the verb grapho. that we get graph or graphology from. The verb to write. So egraphane is a first person singular of grapho in the aorist passive. Let's have a little look at how those lay out with the different number and person. So first person singular, elusamain, going back to using luso as the basis. Elusamain in the first aorist middle voice. Eluso, elusato. Notice one's got a long O sound, one's got a short O sound, so eluso, elusato. Then in the plural, elusametha, elusaste, elusanto. These are middle voice aorists. So it's something that's happened once off, but it's the sense of the voice is middle, usually used for some sort of motion. Continuing using luo as the exemplar, if we were to put that into the passive voice, we would get eluthane, eluthase, eluthae, eluthamen, eluthete, and eluthasan. Note that you've got the theta eta in all of those verbs, and they sound distinctive. Again, good reason to say this out loud. You will hear it. In Mark's Gospel, for example, there's loads and loads of active verbs. Jesus is in command, he's doing loads. And then when you get to the Passion narrative, everything's being done to him. And the verbs are much more in the passive voice. So if you were to read Mark's Gospel out in Koine Greek, even somebody who knew nothing about the Greek would hear the difference. If they were paying attention, they would hear the difference, because you get that they sound suddenly coming back in pretty much almost every sentence. Certainly every sentence with a verb almost would have a passive in there for quite a substantial chunk of text. Eluthane, eluthase, eluthae, eluthamen, elutheta, eluthasan. Now I know what you're thinking. It sounds like loads, and I've put up on screen here what we've done so far. It is loads. There's lots to remember. But you don't have to remember all that. You know, if you want to go on to learn Greek at the highest level, become an academic scholar, then yeah, learn it. Yeah, spend the time learning it. Personally, I put it to songs, well-known tunes, and sung them to learn them. I wrote them on charts and put them up on the walls. I used flashcards and various memory techniques, and I learned them. But nowadays, you can just use software and apps and websites to do that parsing for you. All you need to do is understand what it means. Understand what an aorist is, what a passive voice is, what an indicative mood is. And then you can use that for preaching, teaching, Bible study, stuff like that. But the reason I've just popped these on screen here is I want to just show you that although it seems like tons, you might look down that column I've highlighted there and note that a lot of those endings are actually the same or very similar. So we do actually see a pattern. Most of these ones in the first person end with a nu, and where we've got middles and passives, it's usually eta nu. So and the actives often, they kind of sound more active. So there is a bit of a pattern. Not every single box on this chart is completely different and unrelated to others. Spot the patterns. It will help you to remember. In the second person singular, again, there's a bit of a pattern. These are the ones that end with a sigma, generally speaking. Not all of them, but verbs that do end with a sigma are going to be a second person singular. So again, that's a little bit easier for you to spot. Look at the passives again. You've got the they in there, except for the second aorist, which is always awkward. But you've got aorist and future passives. They both got that they sound in there. They say or theis in there. And ace in the ending for the second aorist passive as well. The patterns continue into the third person singular. Again, you'll see there's quite a lot that end in similar ways. They're just building up these augments theta eta for the passive, an extra sigma in the future, epsilon and sigma in the aorist, things like that. Yes, the second aorist is always a bit awkward, but most of this conforms to a very logical set of rules. Learn those rules, learn what they mean, and it's not actually tons of work to go from knowing nothing about this language to being able to use it in preaching and teaching and Bible study. When I was first setting out on this journey myself, I noticed that it's particularly in the plural, in the first and second person, that you see the endings are very much the same. So if you look at that column, the first person plural verbs always end with men or metha. So there's a very strong pattern there, and whether it's got the they to put it into a passive or the to signify a future or aorist tense, you'll see that they are metha or men for the actives and metha for the middle and passive. The second person plural, again, very similar. You're either going to get ete, or that first epsilon might be elongated into an eta, or ate or este in there. So common pattern in the second person plural as well. And then for the third person plural, there's a few different endings, but again, they're sort of building from a commonality there. So they're not all completely different from each other. I just think if you start to identify some of the patterns, it will be a little bit easier for you to get your head around the different things that are going on here. Let's look through a few verbs. I've put the English transliteration on the screen if you still need that help with your pronunciation of words. But the first example is ginomai, the verb to become, used 671 times. It's the most common middle voice verb. Now you might remember what we call middle voice only verbs. They're called deponents. They're also sometimes called lexical middles, because if you look them up in a lexicon, they'll appear in the middle form. That's because they don't have an active voice form in the present tense. Sometimes when we shift them back into a past tense or push them on into a future tense, they can actually become active. But when you're looking them up in the dictionary, you look them up in the present tense, and if they've got no active voice in the present tense, they will be a deponent. Let's see what that looks like when we push it into the middle voice. And do hit pause if you need to, by the way, because there's quite a lot of information here on screen, and I'm going to be going through these things fairly quickly, so do pause the slides if you need to. So I said the 671 forms. In particular, there's 233 just in the aorist middle. So it is the most used aorist middle verb, and it becomes egenomein. That's the first person singular, middle indicative in the aorist tense. Comes from ginomai and is pronounced egenomein. Another common word that goes into the middle and passive is the verb to answer, apokrinomai. And when that goes into middle voice, it's going to become apekkrinomein. Apekkrinomein. That's used 231 times in all its forms. Apekkrinomein. I answer. You will hear often he answered or they answered for things like when we're talking about the Pharisees answering Jesus or Jesus answering them or the disciples, things like that. So pretty common one here, apekkrinomein. And here it is in the passive voice in Matthew 25. They answered apekkritheisan. So it's the parable about the wise man and the lamp. So the foolish men say, our lamps are going out, give us some of your oil. And the wise man says, no, because there won't be enough. So you go to the dealers and buy some more. He's prepared for that, and the foolish one hasn't. The foolish people haven't. We know it's plural because this verb here is plural and the noun is plural in the sentence. So apekkritheisan, they answered. So it's the foolish men, plural, answering the wise man in the singular. Apekrithesan, they answered. And then another word, example, dunamai. This is a verb to be able to do something. Translated to I can, I am able, or I have the power to do something. You get the word dynamic comes through Latin into the English language, probably from this origin. It's used 209 times in its different forms. Dunamis is the verb for power, the noun for power, sorry. When we put it into its verbal form, it's dunamai, I am able. Dunamis is in the Lord's Prayer, where it says, for yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. It's hoti su est in he basileia, kai he dunamis, kai he doxa. These two sionas. So it's the word for power, or ability to do something. Usually, most times you translate it in terms of a verb, it's going to be I can, they can, you can, they are able to do something. Let's put that in the context and read it in a passage. We have Matthew 17:19 here. Tote proseltontes hoimatheita to Jesu kat idian. So the disciples haven't come to Jesus in private. Apon, they said, Dia ti hemas uk edu themen ek balenautu. Because of what reason were we not able to cast it out? They're talking about the demon. They couldn't cast out the demon, and Jesus says to them, it is because of their lack of faith, or ye of little faith, he says to them in the old translation, quite a famous verse. But the verb dunamis here has gone into an aorist passive, so we have a dunathemen. So that's a first person plural. Remember that the sound, a dunathemen. If you're using Bible Hub, which is the example that I've used for this, you'll see underneath that word there is a V, an A, an I, a P, and then a 1P. Those abbreviations are the parsing. If you hover over them with your cursor, it will come up and say them in full. But in this case, look for the V, that's a verb. A stands for aorist, I for indicative, P for passive. And it's a first person plural, we. We were not able, or why were we not able to do something. Ook is the adversative there, put in front of it, to put it into a negative. So that's why we know it's why are we not able, rather than why were we able. It's ook a dune themen. Another really common one is the verb erkomai, to come, to go. Erkomai means I come. Put that with the English letters below in case you still need that for learning them. But this is one of the most common, used 631 times. Erkomai. And erkomai is a second aorist, so it changes a great deal. The stem is going to change because it's a second aorist. So in the past tenses it looks very different. Here it is as an aorist active indicative, first person singular, aelthon. It's a very common word to be used, so it's worth remembering this one, aelthon. And a very famous example is the John 10:10 example, where Jesus says, I came that you may have life, and life in all its fullness. Here it is in the Greek, ego aelthon, hina zoein ekosin, kai perison ekosin. I came that life they may have, and abundantly they may have it. It's a very literal way of translating that, and we've translated that I came that they may have life, and life in all its fullness. So whilst erkomai is usually in the middle voice, when it goes into that past tense, it's already been done, so it's recorded actively because the action has already been completed. It's not like people are still coming and going. It's something, he came, he went, he did something. So that's why it sort of goes into the active voice as we push it back into the past tense. I came, ego authon is very common. Earlier I mentioned the verb akuo to hear as well. If we look at John 9:32, it says that out of the ages has never been heard that somebody who was blind from birth has had their eyes opened. So ek to ionas uk akuste, the word highlighted there, akuste, third person singular, that's an aorist passive. It has been heard. Hoti eineoxen tis ophthalmus, the word we get ophthalmology from, for example, tuflu gegenemenu. There's the example of an aorist passive there, akuste. The verb to hear is a good one for, as I said earlier, for looking at actives and middles and passives, because it kind of could be either of those voices. And here's a third example from John chapter 19, verse 8, talking about Pilate being afraid. And Pilate has spoken to the Pharisees and said that he can't find anything against them. And they say, let his blood be upon us and upon our people. They're determined to have Jesus crucified. And Pilate's response is, when he heard what they said, he was even more afraid. So, hote un akusen ha Pilatos, when Pilate heard this, ton logon, this word, malon ephobeithe. So all the more he was afraid. And we get phobia from this verb, phobia, or phobo. But I am afraid. It's got the epsilon augment in there, and then it's gone into passive, so it becomes ephobeithe for the third person singular in the aorist indicative passive. And fear is a good example of a passive use verb. It's affecting Pilate negatively in this sense. He is afraid. Ephobeithe. So there you go. But I highlighted the word ephobeithe for you. I'll just say also, by the way, the third from last letter there has got an acute accent on it. I won't go into the rules for accents at the moment. They're pretty complex. But I don't think it's really important at this stage for you, but it does sometimes mean the difference in the meaning of a word. It can change the meaning completely, or be significant in terms of the tenses, or whether there's a contraction in there. It would have a circumflex, for example. There's rules about the iota subscript to learn and stuff like that. But for this time, I just want to point out, when you say the words, if you've got a hard breathing on the word, like with the first letter in this sentence, you get the h sound. So it's hotty there. Or if it was starting with an iota, you get a hard y sound. Ye race means temple, for example. But if you've got an accent over the word, you would, over that letter, you just put some emphasis on that part of the word. So with a ephobeithe in this count, you might think the emphasis would be on the omicron and pronounce it ephobeithe, but the accent is on the first of the two eters. So ephobeithe would be the right way to say that one. And these accents were put in the very early part of the 2nd century, so within living memory of when the Gospels were written, to help people to understand how to pronounce those words. We'll come back to the more detailed rules, but for now just bear that in mind. It's just a bit of emphasis on there, and hard breathings are either h sound or a y sound. So I'll do a practice video to go with this one as well, so you can put some of those things into practice and help you to commit that to memory, but just go through a few things to remember from this little overview of the middle and passive. Aorist is the once-off past tense voice, very occasionally used in the present to mean once-off. Deponents or lexical middles are words that don't have an active voice in the present tense, but deponents can be active in other tenses. The middle voice is usually used for some sort of motion, such as in time or space or thought. A passive voice verb shows that the subject is receiving from the action of the verb. So, for example, Pilate being afraid. The aorist tense verbs have different forms for both the middle and passive voices. So does the future tense. So we will see that theta eta sound coming in, and they'll be different. Whereas in the present, the imperfect and the perfect, the middle and the passive look the same, and you have to work them out from the context which it is. Remember, as I said in earlier videos, the aorist is extremely common, so it's worth getting a handle on what these different things mean. The aorist middle and the aorist passive also occurs in all the moods. So when we come back to looking at subjunctives, which is a verb where we say something happens in order that something else can happen, or so that something else can happen. It's going to happen in infinitives, which we usually translate with to, so to read, to learn, to run. It's going to happen with imperatives, which are instructions to do something. Go and listen, to aorist imperatives, or potentially present, but they're once off. Go and listen is ongoing, so you would put that in the present tense. And this is one that we see quite a lot. Go and listen, come and see. That's good examples of New Testament imperatives. Erkeste et ida, come and see. And lastly, we'll also see participles that have aorist, middle and passive voices as well. But we've got a little way till we come to participles. There's quite a few other things we're going to learn to build up to that sort of knowledge. Just to mention, the text that I've used in this video is from BibleHub.com. You can find that just by going to searching BibleHub, or just go to www.biblehub.com. There's some great free resources there for studying the Bible, and it's got the interlinear Bible, so you can see the Greek text alongside a literal English translation with the strong numbers and the parsing alongside it. There's something here I also discovered has been added quite recently, I think, is that they've got the Septuagint, which is also written in Koine Greek, about 300 to 150 years BC, so it is quite similar to the New Testament, and that's a translation of the Old Testament. Now, ancient Greek is nearer to ancient Hebrew than modern English is, so this isn't the original language of the Old Testament, but it is quite helpful to read the Old Testament in the Septuagint translation, also called the LXX. So I found it quite interesting, and if you know a bit about Koine Greek and as you're learning, that's another resource that you can actually benefit from, is to look at the LXX. Now you see on screen that there is the LXX. If you click on that on Bible Hub, it's going to come up with the text. But if you click on the word next to that, ABP, which stands for Apostolic Bible Polyglot, that will come up with an interlinear version that's going to put the English words alongside it for you, which, if you're watching this video, that's you probably will need, because your Greek won't be at the stage that you can just read it on its own without a translation. Click here for an interlinear version of the New Testament in Greek and the Old Testament in Hebrew. But if, like me, you only know Koine Greek and you want to look at the Septuagint version, you can either do that by clicking on the LXX to see the text on its own, or the ABP to see an interlinear version of that. Once you've navigated to the ABP, then you just stick in the book and the chapter number right at the top to see which particular chapter and book that you want to look at in the Old Testament. So that's really handy. Alongside that, you'll see there's another and a few sets of abbreviations, some out, Tim, Qu, things like that. So that you've got a summary, an outline, a timeline, questions, topics, and things like that. These are really helpful Bible study resources. So if you're leading a Bible study or if you're preaching, then it's well worth going and checking those out. They've uploaded some really exciting new materials there as well for you to use. And it's all free. It's a really great site. So I thought I'd just recommend that to you guys. So thanks for coming and watching this video. This was a bit of a summary overview, and I'll come back and make videos on the passive voice, the middle voice, aorists, and the future passive in a bit more detail at a later stage. But for now, check out, I'll upload in a few days a video to have a bit of a practice of the aorist, middle, and passive. You might also want to take a little look back at the overall structure of Greek and the explanations of the grammar that I did at the beginning of the course, just so you remember what passives and indicatives and middles and tenses like the aorist are all about. And then in the rest of this term we'll be moving on to look at the perfect. I'll mention the imperfect briefly because that's very rare, and then we'll just practice and revise what we've been doing over the last two terms. So bring up some of the possible suggested links for you on screen there. You can click on those to go to those videos. It's a bit of practice for you. If you want any of the graphs, charts of the verbs, then do send me a message. Drop me a message on here, send me an email, and I can send that to you as an image or as an Excel spreadsheet or something. So you, what I've done is put the verbs into the chart, the full chart, which shows all the endings, all the forms for the indicative there, if you need that as well. Otherwise, thanks a lot for coming along. Do put any comments you have in the comments section or any questions that you want to ask. If you're new to seeing this, also I recommend you can click subscribe if you'd like to get a notification about when new videos are uploaded, and just go to your own personal settings and check what notification settings you've got. You can tell it whether it's going to send you an email, whether it will pop up on your phone or things like that, so you can select how you get your notifications as well. But it's no cost to subscribing, it's just there so that you can get the updates when I get around to putting more videos on. Thanks for coming, and I pray that the Lord blesses you as you go about trying to learn one of the biblical languages. I hope that is a rewarding experience for you, as it always has been for me. Thank you, goodbye, and God bless.